Okay, so before we begin this evening, before I introduce our guests, I want to mention that tonight's event is part of the Nature of Writing series, a partnership between Village Books and the North Cascades Institute. NCI is a conservation nonprofit based in Whatcom and Skagit counties with a mission to inspire environmental stewardship through transformative learning experience in nature. They offer programs for people of all ages and backgrounds to explore and engage with nature. Educating people about climate change and its impacts here in the Pacific Northwest is a major part of their work. So hosting Katharine and her new book tonight is a great fit for all of their priorities. North Cascades Institute offers many different programs, including youth programs like Mountain School, a 3-day environmental education experience for local 5th grade students, as well as the Youth for the Environment and People program, which provides an opportunity for high school students to learn about climate change solutions and engage in local stewardship projects. Additionally, they offer a diverse suite of adult and family programs, which includes field excursions, family camps, art and writing retreats, and even boat tours. This fall, the Institute is hosting several online classes that people can participate in from wherever you are, including presentations on coastal ecosystems, diversity in the outdoors, the history of the North Cascades National Park, poetry, cooking classes, and more. It's truly the work that they do and the things that they offer at NCI is just really amazing. You can find out about all of these programs by visiting their website at ncascades.org. And you can also be the first to find out about their upcoming programs and events by signing up for their online newsletter. I'll be sure to drop those links in that chat momentarily. So without further ado, let's get started on the main event. First, I'd like to introduce our moderator for tonight's conversation. Dr. Forrest Inslee is the editor of Christ and Cascadia, a journal focused on innovative faith practice in the Pacific Northwest, and a curriculum design consultant at the Seattle School. In his role as Associate Director of Circlewood, a faith-based environmental advocacy nonprofit, he hosts the Earth Keepers podcast and helps to develop creation, care, education initiatives. So welcome, Dr. Inslee.
Thank you. Thank you.
So in addition to serving as chief scientist for TNC, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe is the endowed professor in public policy and public law and Paul W. Horn Distinguished Professor at Texas Tech University. She served as a lead author for the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th U.S. National Climate Assessment and hosts the PBS digital series Global Weirding. She's the climate ambassador for the World Evangelical Alliance and has been named one of Time's 100 most influential people, Fortune's 50 greatest leaders, and Foreign Policy's 100 leading global thinkers. She's here to discuss her new book, this beautiful book right here, Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world. Welcome, Drs. Hayhoe and Inslee.
Thank you so much for having us, Claire. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Katharine, it's an honor to be with you.
Likewise, it's such a pleasure to be speaking with you. I only wish I could be there in person.
I have to say that I'm glad that they introduced me first, because if they'd put my little intro after yours, I would be put to shame and people would feel really sorry for me. So you're a very impressive person. Hey, I want to start the conversation just by getting us oriented to your latest book, Saving Us. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us why this book at this time?
Well, I am not a big book writer, as anyone who follows me will know. I like to do videos. I like to do social media. I even just joined TikTok last week with my cat, Dr. Evil. Everybody has to be a doctor, right? But the reason I wrote this book is because I couldn't find anything else to answer the number one question that I am getting now every single day. And that question is, what gives you hope? So I figured as a climate scientist, I'm a good person to ask that question to, right? Because if a climate scientist can find hope in a world where every new scientific study seems more dire than the one before, every new headline tells of greater disasters than we thought were coming. Every next headline after that tells of how far we're falling short in meeting our climate targets and our climate commitments. I figured if I could find a source of hope, can't everyone? So I started looking myself because I can't keep on doing what I'm doing if I'm just overwhelmed with bad news all the time. And first of all, I looked to the science. And I realized that as dire as the news is, there is hope, very clear hope in the science. There is hope because the science says that our future is literally in our hands. The choice is up to us. Some impacts are already here today, and some of those impacts are already bad, but they are just a fraction of what we can avoid if we act now. So hope is not the guarantee of a better future. It's the chance of a better future. And science says there is a chance. But where else does our hope come from? Often it comes from recognizing that we're not alone. So often I think we picture climate action as a giant boulder sitting at the bottom of an impossibly steep cliff with only a few hands on that boulder trying to push it up. And if we added our hand, it would do nothing, absolutely nothing. But if we start to look around and see who all is already acting on climate, we realize the giant boulder is already at the top of the hill and it's already rolling down the hill in the right direction. And it's already got millions of hands on it. And if we added our hand, it might go a little bit faster. And if we got everybody else at our place of work or our neighborhood or our school or our church or our city, if we got them to add their hands too, it could go a lot faster. And we could get it going down that hill. And so recognizing that we are not alone, that we really are together, that is a huge part of what gives us hope.
So a lot of books that you see in environmental advocacy today will have some version of a title like Save the Whales, Save the Trees, Save the Earth even. But you've titled your book Saving Us. And I'm wondering, what's that about?
You're absolutely right. I don't know how many books there are with that type of a title, but a lot. When it all comes down to it, though, it is not about saving the planet itself. The planet itself will be orbiting the sun long after we are gone. What is at risk is us living things on this planet. And of all living things after the polar bear, us humans, because we have built our entire civilization on the assumption that climate is relatively stable. We have 2/3 of our biggest cities within a few feet of sea level. We have parceled out all our water and our agricultural land to where now there isn't enough to go around. We are the ones who have built this vulnerability into our very system, and it is us who are most at risk. But unlike the polar bear, we have agency. We understand why it's happening. We are responsible for what's happening, but it's up to us to actually try to fix it.
When I interview authors, I tend to ask them, what do you want to add to the conversation? What's your contribution to the larger conversation around a particular topic? I think in this case, your book is unusual. You are definitely talking about, better ways to care for the earth, but you're actually talking about the conversation itself. How do we actually have a better conversation? And I'm curious, what is the secret then that you're helping us to understand about having the better conversations?
So after what gives you hope, then the next question I always get, and someone might be already thinking of asking it here tonight, is, what's the most important thing I can do? Tell me what is the most important way that I can put my hand on that boulder to get it rolling faster down the hill. And people often expect that I'm going to talk about light bulbs or recycling or diet or electric cars or public transportation or solar panels. And don't get me wrong, all of those things absolutely do help because they're cutting our personal carbon footprint, but they're also changing us. They're changing our investment. They're changing our perspective. They're changing what we can talk about with other people, which in turn can change what they're considering doing. In fact, in the book, I talk about how solar panels are literally contagious. The #1 predictor of whether somebody has them is whether somebody else within a mile of their house has them too. So you see them every time you go past and you think, well, if they have it, maybe I could talk to them. I could see where they got them. I could probably afford it. We live in the same neighborhood. But even that is not the most important thing. The most important thing we can do is what most of us are not doing. 86% of us, according to a survey just last week, are not talking about climate change. And why does talking matter? Because it is about using our voices to advocate for change. And the only way the world has changed before, if we look back in history at the massive ways that our industrialized society has changed, it began not when CEOs or presidents or prime ministers or wealthy people decided that change had to come. It began when individual people did what they could, but the most effective thing was that they used their voices to advocate for the abolition of slavery, for women to get the vote, for the end to apartheid, or for civil rights. It was people using their voice that made that difference. So that's why I wrote the book, is to encourage people to do what we're not doing, which is using our voice, but not to dump a ton of science on people, but to start with something we share, connect the dots to how climate change is affecting it, and then talk about positive, real-world constructive solutions that they can get on board with. So if you don't mind, let's try that out now. All right, tell me something that you care about that's important to you that you might share with people who are listening in.
Well, first I'll answer the question that probably a lot of people in Washington State have, and that is this guy related to Jay Inslee? And the answer is yes, I'm his cousin. He's my older cousin. I'm proud of him. I love Jay's courage, especially when it comes to advocating for the environment. And he's made a lot of good changes, I think, to policies and practices in the state. One of the things I find most intriguing is his plan really to electrify the ferry system. In Washington State, the ferry system is not just a tourist attraction. There's 10 different routes, I think, and 25 million people use the ferry each year. And a lot of them are tourists, but a lot of them are people who need the ferry to get from place to place. So he is advocating really for the transition to making ferries that have no emissions, basically are all electric. And in the process, he is actually helping to fund and create hybrid ferries as a step along the way. So I just love the project because the fact is, and this is a shocking fact, 73% of Washington State's carbon emissions come from the ferry system. That's just unbelievable. I
didn't even know that.
Area is huge.
That is unreal. So he's tackling something that's the biggest piece, the lowest hanging fruit, the biggest piece of the pie. And I mean, how many of you listening knew that that was the majority of the state's emissions?
Yeah. But you know, even with that fact, some people hate Jay and they hate him no matter what, and they hate him for that policy in particular. And it's really hard to understand. It defies logic in my mind. So I personally find it really hard to talk to people who have already made up their minds that they're going to oppose this particular policy or other policies that would benefit the earth.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good reminder that the same approach doesn't work with everyone. And sometimes we just aren't the right person to have that conversation. I mean, for some people, you know, honestly, with your last name, they might be like, that might be it. The door might be closed. In my book, I talk about how I live in Texas, and I was talking to a group of farmers a couple of years ago, and I was explaining how what we're seeing today is not a natural cycle. It's a long-term trend. It's getting warmer, it's getting drier, and it's being caused by us. And at the end of it, one very honest farmer came up to me and he said, you know, everything that you say made sense, and I would like to agree with you. But if I agree with you, I have to agree with Al Gore, and I could never do that. So he was very honest about the fact that his identity was so tied to his politics that he literally could not accept facts that his mind acknowledged were true because of where his heart was. So I learned from that. And in the book, I tell about how the next year I went to talk to a group of water managers. And I was speaking after 2 state elected representatives, both of whom overtly reject the reality of climate change. So they are on record as saying it's not real, it's not us, it's not bad. So elected official number 1, elected official number 2, and then here comes the climate scientist. So I decided I was going to conduct an experiment. I was going to talk all about the observed trends and the future projections and what that meant for water in Texas, for our reservoirs, for our irrigation, for our city water supply, for our long-term plans. But I was never going to mention the words climate and change together. And luckily, I don't have a last name that's associated with anything other than Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the Ramones, and now the Lumineers also. So mostly not negative connotations. So I gave this whole presentation without mentioning these two words together at all. But other than that, it was the same content and the same solutions and the same everything. And at the end, I will never forget, this woman came running up to me and she grabbed my hand and she pumped my hand and she said, "That was fantastic. I agree with everything you said. Those people who talk about global warming, I don't agree with them at all. But this makes sense." Because we had been able to talk about it in a way that did not sort of trigger whatever personal aversions people have to politics, to politicized terms. And we were able to figure out that, yeah, we actually agreed about, like she said, about everything, except what some people would call it. Because when it all comes down to it, what unites us is far more than what divides us. So what are some things in Washington State and in Northern Washington State in particular that you feel like most people would agree on that matter to them?
Well, a lot of people here are sports fishermen, for example, and the fishermen that I know, and there's some in my neighborhood actually, they understand that the orca population factors into the health of the salmon population, right? And so they're very much pro orca and don't mind at all the programs that work for the recovery of the orca population in the Puget Sound. So I could see actually that you could connect the orca issue with the ferry issue, because in fact, when ferries become electric, they make much less sound. And one thing that damages orca populations is their dependency on sound for communication. And the ferry really disrupts that and actually can cause what we'll call social damage actually to their abilities to communicate with one another. So I think that could be one way in actually.
That absolutely could. That's so interesting.
I would even add that, you know, right around where I live, there are people who love their view, right? They live close to the Puget Sound and they want to see what's across the sound. But, you know, these days, especially in the warmer months, it gets so kind of smoggy and you can't see across to the mountains, or it's just a really obscured view. So I'm imagining that there's plenty of people who, you know, you could actually appeal to them on the basis of clearer air, right? And the aesthetic of nature around them as a way into that question, because, you know, tons of carbon are going to be taken out of the air once the ferry system is converted, and that problem will diminish.
Wow, that's a great connection. I didn't even know about that. So the one that my mind immediately jumped to was that the water in streams is getting a lot warmer, which also affects salmon when they go up the stream to spawn. Sometimes it's so warm that they literally can't. And then also, of course, we know as the world gets warmer, wildfires are burning greater and greater area, and the wildfire season is starting earlier and it's ending later. And so, of course, that creates additional pollution that chokes the air, that people are breathing in, that you not only can't see the view, you literally can't take a clean breath of air outside. And I don't know how it was for you this summer, but I know I have friends who live just a little further east, and they were saying that their kids couldn't even go play outside for weeks on end because the smoke was so bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that actually has been one of the things that have made people more open to environmentally friendly policies, is they've seen their children experience the negative effects of climate change. And I think that hits right at the heart.
Mm-hmm. It does. And it's interesting that you said that, because that's one of the perspectives I think that often holds us back, is that we think of this only as an environmental issue. So if somebody is already an environmentalist, if they're already that type of person, then of course they care. But if we only think of it as an environmental issue, which of course it is an environmental issue, but if we only think of it as that, then if we're not an environmentalist, we don't think of it as our issue. But as you just said, it is literally an issue. Like if you're a parent, it's an issue. If you care about your health or the health of your family or people in your community, it's a health issue. It is also a sport issue. It affects winter snow and recreation as well as sport fishing. It is a nature issue if you're a nature lover. It is an economic issue because it affects the economy and it affects the safety of your home. So whoever you are, and this is what I get into the book, and I go through lots of different examples, basically whoever you are, you already have every reason you need to care about climate change. You don't need new reasons. You don't need new values. You don't need a new identity. You just have to figure out how what you already care about is already being affected by climate change. And it's a lot easier when we're having a conversation with an adult You know, with a child, you might be able to change their values if you're their parent and you work at it really hard, right? But once someone's an adult, you know, you get the sense if someone wants to change your values, I'm not very receptive to that. I feel like I am who I am, and I've thought about who I am. And, you know, I feel like I've made the choices I have because they're choices I feel are right choices. But if somebody says, yes, that's right, you know, you're a good mother, you obviously care about your family, you care about science, you care about people. You know, for me, being a Christian, and for you too, that's a big part of who I am. So if somebody sort of approached me and said, you're obviously a good scientist, a good mom, you care about the place where you live, you want to live out your faith. And so clearly because of that, you care about climate change because I'm also this or this, and I care about it because it affects, you know, as a Christian, the least of these. As a mom, it affects our kids. As a scientist, it affects this amazing world that we study. As a person who lives in this location, it affects our homes. And so then it makes me be like, oh yes, so I am that type of person, yes. And then climate action is a much more, it's a genuine expression of who we already are, rather than something that we feel like somebody's sort of trying to push on us because of their priority system, their value system, which is not ours. Does that kind of make sense?
Absolutely. You know, I think that you probably are giving people some courage, and they probably have particular people in mind that they find it difficult to talk to. They've had those difficult conversations that shut everyone down, that trigger everyone. And I mean, honestly, it's not just about the other, it's about us as the communicators. I find myself pretty easily triggered by certain words and positions, and I'll tend to just give up on a conversation. So I guess my question is for you, are there some people that maybe are better to have those conversations with than others? Are there people really that are kind of beyond conversation and we shouldn't knock our heads against that wall?
Yes to both questions. And I'm so glad you asked that question, because often when I say the most important thing we can do is to talk about it, people's minds jump immediately to the person they know who will not shut up about how it's a hoax.
Mm-hmm.
And we all have someone like that, or more than one person like that in our lives. I do. Honestly, every other climate scientist I've talked to does, except for one. I know one climate scientist who doesn't have somebody like that in their lives. Usually it's a family member, or sometimes it's an old college roommate, or sometimes it's a next door neighbor. But we all have someone like that in our lives who is absolutely obsessed with the idea that this is a hoax, and they can't stop talking about it. They bring it up all the time, talking about how those climate scientists just made this thing up out of whole cloth, or they're always saying that the world is going to end and look, everything's just fine. And all those wildfires are just arson, that climate change has nothing to do with it. And if they would just rake those forests, that would fix the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And we just want to stick it to them. We just want to, I want debate point 1, 2, 3, and so they will just say, yes, you're right. You've always been right. I'm so sorry. I have very bad news. That's not going to happen. Why? Because those people, they're only a very small percent of the population. Believe it or not, according to the Yale Program on Climate Communication, those people, dismissive people is what they call them, are 7% of the population. 7%. They're very loud, especially on social media. I meet them on Twitter all the time and Facebook. Only very once in a while on Instagram. People on Instagram are very nice. But my personal definition for a dismissive is someone who would dismiss 200 years of physics, 2,000 scientists, 200,000 scientific studies. And literally, if an angel from God appeared before them with brand new tablets of stone that said global warming is real in foot-high letters of flame, they would dismiss that too. So why would I think they would listen to me? They won't. Because for somebody who's dismissive, climate denial is such a strong part of their identity that is almost like asking them to sort of metaphorically, but at this scale, remove a body part. Like that's how much it's part of them. But here's the good news. 93% of us are not dismissive. And in fact, people who are alarmed and concerned are 55%. 55% are alarmed or concerned. When you add in cautious, we're up to 75%. There's a small number that are disengaged, who've been living under a rock the last 20 years. I would like to find where that rock is. I wouldn't mind spending a bit of time there myself, just a week or two to get away from the world. And then there's 12% who are doubtful. They do have serious doubts. And then there's the 7% who are dismissive. But here's the thing. Even people who are alarmed, the majority of people who are alarmed, and this is not in my book, because the Yale program on climate communication, they didn't do the alarm study till after I wrote the book, but I asked them, I said, I have a bet. I said, I bet that most alarmed people are not talking about climate change and are not activated on climate change. And so they're like, oh, okay, we're going to look at that. So they did. And here's the result. They're not. Even alarmed people are not talking about it. In fact, we often self-silence because we assume that everybody around us thinks the same thing we do. Everybody around us is as depressed as we are. Nobody has anything good to say about it. So we just don't talk about it. So who can we talk to? Anybody in the 93%, but especially people who we share something with. So the best thing to do is, and try to do this now for yourself, make an inventory. So I'm going to do it myself first. Then Forrest, I'm going to ask you to do it. And then everybody who's listening, I want you to do this inventory for yourself too. And if you want to, you can put it in the chat, or if you don't want to share, you can just sort of keep it to yourself. But I want you to do this inventory to see what you might connect with people on. Okay. So first of all, I am a scientist. So obviously I can connect with people who like science. So this could be people at museums. This can be often kids love science. This can be fellow scientists. But I'm a lot more than just a scientist. I'm also a mom. So I can absolutely have conversations with other parents and grandparents. In fact, I co-founded an organization called Science Moms because I learned that 86% of mothers in this country are worried about climate change and have no idea what to do about it. So we co-founded Science Moms, and I'll put a link to that in the chat if anyone wants to check it out. And it's for any mom, and to be totally honest, we have quite a few dads and grandparents and aunts and uncles who have snuck in too. So, there's no check on who you are before you join. Sciencemoms.com to share information about what climate change is, why it matters, and what we can do to fix it. And you can follow us on social media too. So what else do I do? Well, I love winter sports. I'm Canadian. So I grew up cross-country skiing, downhill skiing, snowboarding, snowshoeing, winter camping, skating on the frozen ice. I love the winter. And of course, the warmer it gets, the shorter our winter season. We used to flood our backyard every year to skate on, and now you can't even do it where I live, where my parents live. The ski season is getting shorter. Where I live, we ski over in New Mexico a lot, and we didn't even have a season 2 years ago, just before COVID. So I can talk to other people who also enjoy skiing. And then, of course, I live in Texas, so I can talk to people who are from Texas about what's happening in Texas. And I'm a Christian. And so I talk to people about how the Bible says at the very beginning of the Bible that God gave humans responsibility over every living thing on this earth. I talk to people about how through the whole Bible, it talks about God's love and care for the most seemingly insignificant aspects of nature. I talk about how we Christians are supposed to be recognized by our love for others. And how loving is it when we close our eyes and our ears to the suffering that climate change is causing, and when instead we just point judgy fingers and are known more for our hate and our judgment than our love for others. So each of those different things, being a scientist, being a mom, living in Texas, being a Canadian, loving the winter, being a Christian, all of those things offer me a chance to connect with people over something that I share. All right, Forrest, over to you.
This is so unfair because I know you thought about that beforehand. So
that's why I went first.
Okay, good job. Okay, so I, among other things, I'm a podcast host, and the podcast is all about creation care. So every day at least whenever I'm podcasting, I'm trying to help people to understand the urgency of the tasks, what they can do. But if I back out of that as my kind of primary audience, the other thing I do is I teach community development and social justice. And a lot of my students are headed toward careers that are really aimed at helping the poor, for example, or aimed at bringing equity to situations in communities. And I think that oftentimes the thing that community development oriented people miss is the environmental justice factor. They're so oriented toward the well-being and health of people. That's their main priority. that they can miss out on the rest of the community that really ecology is, right? And so community development can be expanded, I think, to include nature as the community, your environment as part of the community. So I'd say that would be another group that for me would be expanded beyond the sort of obvious people I talk to.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, people who are oriented toward community development and social justice really do have that bias in favor of the well-being of people that I think makes them miss the bigger picture. I'd say another point of concern for me, and maybe another audience that I ought to be connecting with more, would have to do with, I'm not sure how to say it, it has something to do with my daughter, who is 19.
Mm-hmm.
And her generation, just sometimes it feels like many of them have given up, right? And so they'll talk about things like, being afraid to have children because they don't want to bring kids into the world that they're afraid of that's coming. So I think sometimes I hold back from talking to parents about those issues when I have plenty of opportunities to do so.
Mm-hmm.
Because, talking first about the love of our children is a great way into caring about anything that affects them. And certainly in terms of climate change, there is a clear connection between where this the millennial generation is in terms of their outlook, their hope, or the lack of hope, and what's coming in terms of climate change. So those are 2 points of connection I thought about.
Yeah, I like that last one. That one's so important. A new survey just came out surveying young people in 10 countries. And overwhelmingly, young people are not just alarmed about climate change, but panicked, depressed, overwhelmed. I mean, I see that among my own students. I teach undergraduate students. One of my colleagues had a student who was so panicked that if she just said the words climate change, the student would have a panic attack. And that fear is rational. It is informed by an awareness of how truly bad this is. Again, it's not about the end of the planet. It's about us. It is about the future of civilization as we know it. It is about our lives, which we take for granted, that we have electricity and water and a safe place to live and a thing called the economy. We take these things for granted. And these are the things that we will not have if we do not fix climate change. So that is definitely something that we can address, because who needs hope more than those who fully recognize how bad this is? And it reminds me of something that Greta Thunberg said, which she herself, of course, is still a very young person, although such a powerful voice. And she began by being very anxious about climate change. And so she convinced her family to stop flying, to change their diet, to reduce their carbon footprint, to do everything they could personally. And if she had stopped there, they would have certainly, made their personal changes, but they would have had no greater change in the world. She did one more extra thing, and this is why we know her. She took a piece of white cardboard and she just painted a few words, School Strike for Climate, and she went and she sat outside a building, which of course was the Swedish parliament. And because she used her voice to advocate for change, that is why we know her. And that is how she inspired millions of other young people and people in general around the world. And if she can use her voice, who else can use their voice? Can't we all use our voices? And sometimes we might be using our voices literally talking. Other times we might be using them through writing, through sharing. You use yours in your podcast. We might use ours in social media or making videos, or as a teacher, or as somebody who is active in our community or in our neighborhood organization or in our city or at our place of work. Or we can even use our voice in terms of where we bank, what credit cards we have, where our retirement is invested, because what's happening to that money? What's it being used for? There are so many different ways we can use our voice, and they're unique to each of us, but we're so powerful in that we can do that. So I love that. Let's see, in the chat, we had Margaret share that for her, she's a science educator. She's a mom and a grandmother. She's a Quaker. She gardens and she rents. And that's something that you can talk about, because when you're a renter, you can't make the same changes as if you own your home. So that's something to kind of talk with people about, like, oh, I tried doing this and I know I couldn't do that, but have you thought of this? So those are all things that you can begin the conversation with people on, which is great. And then somebody else says buying equals voting. And that is absolutely true. You can speak with your money. And you can speak with your vote too. All of those things are ways to use your voice. And in fact, of course, there's this big vote on the infrastructure bill coming up in Congress, which is a federal policy to address climate change. It is our biggest hope for climate legislation. So if you have a voice, now is a very good time to use it. Our Science Moms website actually has a link that you can click. The Nature Conservancy also has a link that you can click to send a message to your elected representative saying, stay strong, vote for this, encourage your peers and your colleagues to too. All right, so we've got a lot of great comments here. Do we want to talk about anything else, or do we want to go to some of the questions? By the way, start putting your questions in the Q&A, please. You can comment in the chat, but we'll take questions from the Q&A. What do you think, Forrest?
Well, I want to ask you one more question. I think
when
people read your book, you were really present in the book. You're open and honest with your stories, and even with your vulnerabilities. And I think that makes it a much more compelling case that we can also speak when we listen to you using your voice. And I'm just wondering, where did it come from? How did you get to be this person who has the courage to speak up for the environment?
Well, again, it's not just the environment I'm speaking up for. I feel like I'm speaking up for all of us living things. Because in many ways, I feel like we climate scientists are like the physicians of the planet. So imagine if you were running a low-grade fever that went up and down from day to day, but it ticked steadily upwards week after week. And then you went in to see a physician and they ran a bunch of tests. And then they spoke to almost every other physician around the world. And they shared the test results. And they all concluded that you were suffering from an unprecedented brand new condition known as global warming. And that the only thing to do was to stop burning fossil fuels as soon as possible, build resilience to the impacts that you could not avoid anymore, help nature help us. Nature would like to soak up some of the carbon we've produced if we can restore and invest in ecosystems. And all the doctors in the world agreed, but you didn't want to listen. And then it turned out everybody in the world had this fever, including the doctors themselves, but nobody wanted to listen. That's the situation that we're in today. And so as someone who knows how serious it is, and you don't have to be a scientist today anymore to know how serious it is, all you have to do is look outside your window during wildfire season. It's really up to all of us to share that, because what's at risk again is not our great-great-grandchildren. It is not people who live over on the other side of the world. It is not only the non-human living species, although they are certainly at risk too. It is us here and now today. And so I definitely get discouraged. I definitely get frustrated. I have stories in the book of conversations that went horribly wrong. And they're sort of unintentionally humorous often. And I feel like I learned the most from them in retrospect, but they didn't feel good when they were going on. I can tell you that. But I keep on going because it is the truth. And because of what's at stake, it's my son's future that's at stake. And, you know, as a mom, I would do anything for him. And today, anything means fighting for a fix to climate change.
Well, I just want to tell you that I thank you for your vulnerability. Again, I think that because you let us into your learning process and into your failures, as you put it, it absolutely makes talking doable, to finding those points of conversation and connection. So I think this is going to really be an impetus for freedom for a lot of people to speak up. So I thank you for that personally.
Thank you.
So Claire, you have got some questions from our audience.
I do. And first, I would like to say I do love that exercise. I think it's great to think about all your points of connection in your individual life. That's a wonderful exercise. So thank you for that. And
can we put you on the spot? Give us a couple of yours.
Okay. So, well, I'm going to steal some from that were already said.
That's okay.
But one of them would be, so mom, grandmother, renter, and then a person who works in events, works with the public. on a wide, range of events on topics that happen, all across the spectrum. So, and as a bookseller, I make so many connections as a bookseller. Like, I mean, that's a never-ending potential for conversation there. Those would be mine.
Yes, those are great. Great.
I would like to bump my question to the top of the list just because I can. So talking to young people about the situation that the earth is in today, talking about having hope and healing, as the title of your book suggests. I picked up my 13-year-old from school today, and she was quite despondent because in social studies today, they were talking about certain rivers that are drying, that the levels of water are so low. So they were learning a lot about the water shortage and crisis. What do you say to young people that can give them a feeling of hope rather than why bother when the future is bleak?
I would say, first of all, as a scientist, I know that the future depends on our choices. I know that our choices will literally make all the difference in the world. So now more than ever is the time to act. And in fact, I close the book with a quote from one of my other favorite books, which is All We Can Save, a compendium of 60 women's voices on climate. And Katharine Wilkinson is one of the two people who put All We Can Save together. And I close the book with her words reflecting on the choices that we have to make today. And she says this, which I think is really amazing. She says, we flip it on its head. It is a magnificent thing to be alive in a moment that matters so much. This is a moment that will be written about in the history books if we have history books. And whether we do or not is literally up to us. And so if we decide, Christiana Figueres, who was the architect of the Paris Agreement, a Costa Rican diplomat who's just the most amazing woman, after she finally got all the countries in the world to come together and agree on the Paris Agreement, which was an absolutely superhuman effort and frankly a miracle, she went and she wrote a book about what the world would look like in 2030 if we acted. It's called The Future We Choose. So after you read Saving Us, I recommend reading The Future We Choose because it paints a picture of the clear blue skies, the healthy air, the abundant food and electricity, the walkable cities, the health, the abundance of what that world would look like with climate solutions. And then she says at the very end, the biggest lesson we learned, imagining we were in 2030, looking back until now, she said, the biggest lesson we learned is that we were only ever as doomed as we believed ourselves to be. So if you're afraid, I feel you. I see this science myself every day. If you feel panicked, if you feel overwhelmed, I hear you. I feel that way myself sometimes too. But the antidote to despair, quoting Joan Baez, is the antidote to despair is action. When we go out and act, hope is everywhere. When we connect with other people and we lend a hand to that giant boulder, we realize it's not sitting at the bottom of the hill. It really is rolling down the hill, and we can make it go that tiny bit faster. That's where we find our hope. That's where we find our encouragement. So if you're down, decide to act. Don't wait till you feel like it, because you won't feel like it. Make a decision to do it. Find a group, an organization, something local that you can do. Follow someone on social media. Follow a group on social media that shares your interests and your values. Sign up for what they do. Share their posts. Find something somewhere that you can do. And when you do that, when you act, you will find hope.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Great answer. And Mallory in the chat said that she read both of the books that you cited, and that they're fantastic. So another plug for those books.
Yes.
So an anonymous attendee wants to know if you have climate conversation starters that work.
Yes, I do. And I'm just putting the names of those two books in the chat. The Future We Choose. Okay. There's the two books in the chat that we just talked about. I absolutely do have conversation starters. And in fact, I wrote the whole book and then I got my sister to read it for me. She's a very good critical reader. And she's like, you're missing the chapter on how to actually do it. I was like, well, doesn't everybody? She's like, no, write a chapter on how to do it. Step one. Step 2, step 3, when to end, when to back away, what to follow up on. So I did. And we've already done step 1. Step 1 is to make an inventory of things that are important to you, or even Forrest, you snuck one in earlier about something that's not important to you, but it's important to your neighbors that you can identify with, which is they fish. So they care about the orca, and you care about the orca too. And so that's a point of connection. You might not fish, but you have that point of connection that you both care about the orca. So figure out something that you can connect with people on. And then the best thing to do is actually start asking them about it. Ask them about their passion, their hobbies, their kids, their job, their latest canoe trip. Ask them about it, and then connect the dots. I'm really into that too. And I've been really worried, speak from the heart rather than the head. I've been worried myself about this. Did you know that this is happening? Did you know that we can see this happening where we live? I'm worried about, how do you feel about it? Ask, don't tell them how they feel, ask them how they feel. But always, always, always have a positive, constructive solution that you can talk about, which could be something that you do in your personal life. It could be something that your city is doing. Did you know? It could be something that your state is doing. It could be something a company is doing. There's lots of companies who are doing good things, many of them based in Washington state. Give them something that is being done and talk about what could we maybe do together, for both parents of our kids' school, or if we live in the same neighborhood, or what's something that we might be able to do together. And so in the book, I definitely have lots and lots and lots and lots of examples. Examples of conversations that have started with talking about beer, or talking about knitting, or talking about, some of the most inconsequential things that you could possibly imagine. I do not mean to offend people who are beer aficionados, but in the grand scheme of things, it really, really is important to begin with something we agree on rather than something we disagree on, and something that starts with the heart rather than the head. And again, we're not trying to convert someone to a new religion. We're not trying to renovate somebody's house for them, so to speak. We're just knocking on the door and asking to have a conversation, because you know what? We never do, or rarely do. And when we do, we might find that we have a lot more in agreement than we thought we might. And we might be able to start coming up with some ideas on how we could put our own hands on the boulder and encourage a few more to join.
Katharine, I think I understand maybe your impulse not to have a step-by-step process initially. I think sometimes when it gets boiled down to a process, that actually works against listening. And it seems to me that listening is the key to all of this process. If you aren't truly hearing someone, hearing their heart, hearing their fears, hearing their concerns, then you're not doing this connecting at the level of their interests. It's just not going to happen. Mm-hmm. So that's what I appreciate about the book, is that you really emphasize listening as the foundation to everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that can be said for just about anything in the world, really.
Well, and that's actually the secret of the book. You just think it's about climate change, but what it's really about is this. If we can come together on the number one most politically polarized issue in the whole country, which is literally climate change, you might think it's some other things, but no, climate change keeps topping the list year after year for the last decade. Mm-hmm. What else could we come together on by doing the same thing? Listening, finding common ground, and figuring out solutions that work for all of us. It's not going to work for absolutely everything. There can only be one president of the United States. But for many other things, I think it really can work, because as humans, again, what we have in common is far more than what divides us.
I was very shocked by that figure that you said at the very beginning, 86% of people that don't talk about climate change, and that was shocking to me. Mm-hmm. So I would like to, the very first question that was asked by Howard. How much hope do you place in natural climate solutions, for example, tree planting, regenerative agriculture, or biochar, as a way to draw down atmospheric carbon? Also, given Bellingham's coastal location, would you encourage blue carbon projects as a natural climate solution?
Well, as a scientist, I actually wouldn't use the word hope, because I look at the data. And the Nature Conservancy is one of those organizations that has a lot of scientists that have specifically studied natural climate solutions. What are those? Well, of course, they include tree planting. That's probably the first one everybody thinks of. But tree planting is not the biggest part of them. Restoring degraded ecosystems, continuing to conserve and protect existing ecosystems because they keep taking up carbon as they grow. Also, smart agricultural practices like cover crops, permaculture, regenerative agriculture, biochar, all of those things that put carbon back in the soil where we want it, where it's good and it's healthy, rather than up in the atmosphere where we have too much of it. When you put all of those things together, they have the potential, if implemented at scale, to take care of as much as 30% of our emissions. That is really stunning. But it's not 100% because there is no single solution. There is no one solution that will fix everything, no matter what you might have heard. I hear a lot from people who say they have the solution. There is no the solution. There are dozens of great solutions, and there's an amazing resource called Project Drawdown. You can find it online at drawdown.org. I'm going to put a link in the chat here. Just a second, drawdown.org, where they list about 100 different solutions. Some of them are efficiency solutions. Some of them are agroforestry, silvopasture, smart agriculture, restoring ecosystems. Some of them are behavior modification, like the education of women and girls that reduces infant mortality and helps women support their families, especially in low-income countries. Reducing our food waste. There's all kinds of amazing solutions. And when people say, should I do this or this? My answer is yes, because we need this and this. Blue carbon refers to things like farming kelp and other rapidly growing species in the ocean that take up carbon there too. There are so many amazing solutions. There's no one perfect one, but depending on where we are, there's so many things that we can do. And at this point, we are, according to the IPCC, we're in code red territory. It is all hands on deck, load the lifeboats as soon as possible. And that means that everything that looks like a lifeboat should be loaded. So we need to be doing as much as we can, as fast as we can. Why? Because the more we do, the better off we'll all be.
Well, that, oh, go ahead, Forrest.
I was waiting for this to happen because I hear that the millennials are blaming the generations before them for letting this problem get out of hand. Like, why didn't you do anything? And I agree with them. But when someone actually confronted me on that, I didn't have an answer. Like, why did you wait? Why didn't you act? And I realized that part of it is I'm part of the Star Trek generation, right? Where mankind is noble and beautiful and technology will take us anywhere we want to go. I think there's something embedded in my generation, at least, that believes that technology will always get us out of the mess, right? It has gotten us out of messes before, but the flip side of Howard's question is, what about the technological solutions? Do we put any faith in those?
Mm-hmm. That is a great insight, Forrest. I think you're very right. I think a lot of people have what I would call a false hope that if we just wait it out, something miraculous, the Star Trek will come along and save us. Yeah. And we might have been waiting for that a little too long, because at this point, it is not up to somebody in the future. It's not up to some new technology. It is not up to Bill Gates. It is up to us to solve this. And certainly there's many people who have their hands on that boulder. And Bill Gates' book, which is really interesting because the cover almost looks a bit like mine, but it's pretty much the opposite side of the spectrum from mine, if you kind of went like this, because it's all about the big tech solutions that big tech people with lots of big tech money can invest in. So if you're listening and you're an ultra rich person who wants to know where to put their money, Bill Gates' book is a really good book for you. But if you're not, just to be clear, and I'm a university professor. Are you, Forrest?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, he is. I'm not. No, I assume that was kidding. We are not. And so for that, that's who I wrote. Are you, Claire? Okay, she's saying she's not either. All right.
Oh, I thought you were asking if I were a professor.
Oh, no, you're a professor. I'm asking if you're an extremely wealthy person with billions of dollars to burn.
If only.
Yeah, right. So here we are. None of us are the Jeff Bezoses or the Bill Gates of the world. Right. So we are who I wrote the book for. I wrote the book for every single one of us, because do not be discouraged. When we look, again, at the big issues in our past, when we look at slavery, when we look at civil rights, when we look at apartheid, did they end because a techno guru swooped in and saved everyone? No. They ended because everybody did their part. And the people whose names we remember the most are people who were not rich. They were not famous before they started to use their voice. They were not particularly influential or powerful. They were powered by simply one thing, and that was the force of their convictions.
Yeah. Well, I think we have time for a couple more quick questions that I'm really hoping that you don't mind addressing. We have a question about adoption of children. If people are concerned about bringing children into this crisis situation, do you know if there has been an increase in adoption of children recently?
I'm going to say, I'm sorry, I have no idea.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not that kind of scientist. I would hope
Okay.
so myself,
Yeah.
but yes.
Okay. And then Raymond would like to know, and I'm curious about this as well, because I have actually never heard of this. Should I be purchasing carbon offsets when I fly? If so, do you have a specific program you'd recommend? I'm going to ask because I don't know. What is a carbon offset?
So a carbon offset is where you can pay to invest in a reputable company. That's very clear, because there's some companies that have given it a bad reputation, but there are many good reputable companies. I use a nonprofit called Climate Stewards is the one I use. And they invest in restoring ecosystems, clean cook stove programs in low-income countries that increase people's quality of life, that restore environmental health, and that take a certain amount of carbon out of the atmosphere for a measurable amount of time. That is very important, because if they plant a tree and somebody cuts it down the next year, that doesn't count. There has to be guaranteed longevity of these projects. And so the organization I use, they actually are so cautious that they double it. So you actually pay for double, such that even if half of it gets lost, you still covered your carbon. But I like their motto, and their motto is reduce everything you can first, and then offset the rest. So that speaks to, it isn't just like, oh, I can still go to Bali for yoga holidays and I'll just buy the carbon offsets. If everybody did that, there wouldn't be enough planet for all the carbon offsets. So, but at the same time, that recognizes, and the reason why I do it is because I recognize I live in a society where we cannot go carbon free on our own initiative. My goal, as I just put in the chat, my goal is not to inspire people to change their personal lifestyles. My goal is to inspire people to change the world. Abolitionists wore cotton, yet they argued for the freedom of slaves. You know, people who argue for wage equity work for an employer. We all live within this system, and what has to change is the system itself, so that everyone can have carbon-free energy, whether they can afford solar panels or not. Everybody can live a carbon-free life, whether they're interested in it or not. Our goal is literally to change the world. And that if we keep our eye on the ball, we realize that, you know what, do everything we can, offset the rest, because I do it because it's the right thing to do. And it's not even very expensive. But if you're living on a small budget, you might not be able to do it. And that's okay, because the choice is not personal purity. The choice is saving us.
Wow. Well, thank you. I think that is an excellent note to end on. We have reached the end of our hour. There are many questions. I had a feeling that was going to happen, and we could go into the nighttime answering all the questions. So I appreciate the audience. I appreciate your interest and your engagement, and for showing up this evening. And of course, I am putting in the chat, as the bookseller in the room, there is the link to the Village Books website where you can purchase a copy of this. And I think that probably this will answer some of those questions that are still kind of left that we're not able to get to this evening. So Drs. Hayhoe and Inslee, I just can't thank you enough. This was just a wonderful event. And so is there anything you would like to say to the audience before we go?
Well, thank you, everybody. And I would like to end with one thing. In my opinion, the most important chapter in my book is the chapter on guilt. Because I saw a lot of questions. How do I talk to other people about their flying? How do I talk to other people about them having children? How do I talk to other people about violating one of my personal 10 green commandments? And my answer is, you don't. Because you know what? Pretty much everybody in this world knows. Even the big farmer down the road from me, I talk about this in the book, who's completely dismissive on climate change. He knows his truck produces a lot of CO2. Guilt is our enemy. Guilt will overwhelm us. And when we point judgy fingers at other people, that just turns them off. What is our goal? Our goal is to show people the joys of engaging in climate action. And you know what? When they come along and they put that hand on that boulder, they'll look around and see what other people are doing. You can talk about what you're doing yourself. And I talk actually a lot about my personal carbon footprint and my travel and stuff in the book, but talk about what you're doing and the decisions that you made and why you made them. And especially the ones that give you joy. Talk about you. Do not tell other people what to do, because that is a sure recipe to fail. But if we instead talk about where we want to go together, talk about the things that you're doing that are contagious, literally contagious, talk about things that you could do together to make a difference, to help them be part of the solution. That is how we bring people together, and that is how we bring people along. Forrest?
I cannot follow that except to say thank you to you. And I want to say thank you to Claire as well, because I think in many ways what you're doing at Village Books is exactly what Katharine's talking about. Is like we all have to do our part, and all of our parts are important, every bit of it. So I love what you all are doing to help this movement for change.
Well, thank you. It's absolutely my pleasure. So, all right. Well, I think with that, we will say good night. So thank you, everyone, and be well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.